Okay, just a second. Let me get the screen enlarged here. Okay, tonight we're going over Principles of Crop Production, Chapter 19. This chapter deals with the main grass crops, or basically crops that are in the grass family. Okay, the first one is corn. Corn is, besides wild rice, corn is the only cereal crop that's native to the Americas, and it's thought to have originated in south central or southwestern Mexico. It may have been domesticated 8,000 years BC or more, and it may be related to a plant called teosinte. That's the plant in the far left picture. And then the center picture shows a corn and teosinte hybrid, and then the one on the right shows modern corn. You can see that teosinte was a plant it had several branches on it, and the cobs were a lot smaller, where modern corn has been there's only one main stem, and the cobs have been bred to be a lot larger. And as far as the history of corn, the natives, the Incas, Mayas, Aztecs, in Mexico and Central America and South America used corn as a basic food source, and they selected for larger kernel size and adaptation to specific environments. They actually were breeding corn, even though they maybe didn't know how, the heredity process worked, they were able to breed corn for specific purposes. Because scientists have discovered more than 300 races of corn. Those are like local varieties from the Mexico, South America, and Central America, that area. And the Native Americans also traded corn throughout the North and South America, and over time selected plants that could grow under the shorter growing seasons in the North. And corn was often intercropped with beans and squash as one of what were called the Three Sisters. Supposedly, the corn was planted in rows, probably further apart than we plant it now, because they planted by hand. And the beans would vine on the corn, and the squash would grow in between. And I tried this in my garden, and it didn't work very well. The plants, the squash plants got shaded too much and just got moldy, but I assume it probably worked better, and because these areas where they grew it were a lot drier, and then they also didn't plant the corn as close together. And as far as we know, no wild forms of modern corn exist. The plant would no longer grow if humans didn't collect and replant the seed and cultivate it. And right now, corn is the most important crop in the United States, based both on acreage and economic value. And it's grown in every state in the continental U.S., but it's concentrated in what we call the Corn Belt states: Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, that area. And this chart is also in your book, so I won't read it in detail to you. It just shows the acreage and yield of the top producing states in 2009. Iowa is number one. You can see the others. North Dakota has quite a bit in mostly the east. The southeastern corner is also quite a bit of corn grown in that area. And okay, this slide just shows just a description and adaptations of the plant. It's an annual grass. That means it only reproduces from seed. It can grow from 10 to 15 feet tall, depending on the variety. It's monoecious. That literally means one house. It's got separate male and female flowers, but they're on the same plant. And the male flowers are the tassel, and that's the top of the plant. The female flowers are the ears, or they're in the leaf axils, where the leaf joins with the stalk. And so the silks are basically like the stigma style of an ordinary flower. They produce the pollen. It falls down on on the developing ears, and then it kind of grows up, a pollen tube inside to fertilize the developing ear. And there's two types of roots on a corn plant. The primary roots are below the ground, and they're the main conducting system for water and nutrients, like most plants. And then there's also usually brace roots. They're above ground roots. You can see them above the ground, and they act to support the plant and keep it from falling over in, wet or windy conditions. And corn is a short day crop. It's originated in the tropics. The short day crop means that it flowers after in the summer when the days have gotten as long as they're going to get, and then they start getting shorter again, then that stimulates short day crops like corn to flower. And doesn't tolerate temperatures below freezing. Like I said, it's a tropical plant. And the seed germinates at temperatures above 50 degrees. They won't, if you plant and it gets cold, colder than 50 degrees in the soil, the seed will just sit there. And it also grows best when daily temperatures average about 70. And the average amount of water to produce a corn crop in the Midwest is about 20 to 40 inches per year. It doesn't do as well in, drier areas than that. And there's several different types of corn. The bottom picture shows several different varieties just from Peru alone. There's, hundreds of different varieties. But some of the main varieties that are grown for different purposes are shown here. Dent corn is one that's a major one that's most widely grown corn type. It's got a hard endosperm basically at the sides and back of the kernels, and then it's called dent corn because a depression or a dent forms at the top of the kernel as the soft starch layer dries and shrinks and it becomes mature. And then sweet corn, there's not a picture of it here, but sweet corn is the type you're used to eating, corn on the cob or canned corn. It's got a really high sugar content and no starch really to speak of. And so it tastes fairly sweet. And then flour corn has got a softer starch layer. It doesn't have the hard endosperm and it doesn't have a dent. And it's used for ease of grinding because it's used for making tortillas and corn chips and things like that. And then flint corn is a really hard kernel. It's got a thick, hard endosperm, and it's resistant to insects, fungi, diseases. It stores better than flour corn. It was one of the first corns adapted to the northern temperate regions, but today it's mostly grown as an ornamental. And then this slide just shows some special types of corn. Popcorn, what you raise for maybe popping and eating for a snack, is similar to flint corn, except it's got smaller kernels, so it's kind of a hard kernel. But it's also got starch with an expansion property that makes it pop when it's heated. And the moisture content should be about 14% for popcorn. And then ornamental corn, the top picture, it's also called Indian corn, selected for, variable kernel color characteristics. It's usually a flint or flour type corn, but it's grown mainly for decoration and, for making ornaments out of. Then pod corn is an odd type. Each kernel is enclosed in a pod or a husk, like wheat or another grass. And so it kind of looks like a big, maybe a head of wheat or something. And it may be one of the most primitive types of corn that's still around. And these days it's grown just as a novelty. It's, because each little kernel has its own pod, so it's difficult to harvest and use. And then there's some other special purpose corn types. There's like highly fermentable types that are made for ethanol production. And also some with greater oil content for corn oil. And then white corn is basically the same thing as yellow corn, but it doesn't have the carotene. That's a pigment that turns, plant tissues yellow. And it's also used for tortillas, taco shells, and things like that. Only, obviously the cornmeal is white instead of yellow. And this pie chart just shows the uses of corn. And, this is from your book also, so I won't spend a lot of detail on it. You can see the biggest use is feed and the residual uses. And then a lot is used these days for fuel, for ethanol. The problem with that is that ethanol made from corn is actually it takes more energy to produce it than you get out of it when you burn it in your car. And so there's research on other plants that would maybe not be so costly to produce. It's like if ethanol wasn't subsidized these days, it would be more expensive than gas. And then a few other uses, like high fructose corn syrup is the green. That's a sweetener that's, used in a lot of products. There's some, controversy over some people, maybe unhealthy, maybe contributes to insulin resistance and diabetes and other things. So there's some caution about eating too much of it. And okay, the next plant we're going to go over is wheat. It's also a grass. Triticum aestivum is the scientific name. Wheat was domesticated, a long time ago. It originated in the Fertile Crescent. That's the area that's now like Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. That area is one of the first areas there where farming, was done. And so maybe 10,000 years ago or more, but in the early days, wheat was less important than barley, but it eventually replaced barley because it's more easily extracted from the hulls, and it can be made into bread. And Spanish explorers introduced it to the Americas in the 1500s. There was no wheat here before that, or at least not, the type that's grown as grain. It's called the staff of life because of the importance of bread to human nutrition all over the world. And it's the most important grain crop in the world right now. It's the third leading grain crop in the United States. And the states with greatest wheat acreage: Kansas, North Dakota, Montana, Washington, South Dakota. And before wheat could become a major crop, plant breeding for disease resistance was necessary because wheat stem and leaf rust, which are fungal diseases, would cause huge losses if they got started in the field. And this just shows a description of the plant and, some of the characteristics. It's also an annual grass, has 3 to 5 tillers per plant. Tillers are the little side branches, that come up. And the inflorescence, or the flower head, is a long cylindrical spike. Kind of a tight, like spike of grains, and contains about 30 grains. And wheat is adapted to temperate climates with moderate temperatures and rainfall about 10 to 20 inches. So it's, it's not a tropical plant like corn. It's more of a temperate. That's why it grows very well in North Dakota. And there's 2 major types depending on, the life history of the plant and when it's grown. Spring wheat is planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. And it's grown more in northern areas such as the Dakotas, Montana, Minnesota, up into Canada. And then winter wheat is planted in early fall and overwinters, and the ground matures in the following summer. It's cold tolerant, and it actually needs a cold period in the winter, which is called vernalization, or it won't flower in the spring. So like if it was grown in a tropical area where you don't get a cold winter, it wouldn't flower in the spring. And most of it is planted in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. There's getting to be more and more in the Dakotas, and then, as long as there's not a really, really cold winter that might kill it off in the winter. But, and in the South, sometimes winter wheat can be grazed in the fall or winter and harvested in the spring. And wheat is a long day plant, as opposed to corn that was a short day plant. So it flowers earlier than corn would, because when it flowers about the time when the days or starts flowering about the time when the days are as long as they're going to get, before they start getting shorter again. And, wheat, as we already mentioned, one of the most important uses of wheat is bread making. And bread some types of bread have a few other ingredients, but the main ingredients are wheat flour, sugar, water, salt, and yeast. Yeast is the stuff that makes it rise. But the rising properties depend on gluten. It's a protein found in certain types of wheat. And gluten is actually a compound of 2 proteins, gliadin and glutenin. And what it does is it binds with the starch in the flour, and it forms a spongy matrix, kind of a skeleton almost, that traps the carbon dioxide. And when the yeast are like little one-celled fungi, and when they ferment the sugar, and then they give off carbon dioxide, and then the carbon dioxide bubbles are trapped, and that's what makes the bread rise. And this, once again, this table is from your book, so I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. It just shows the different market classes of wheat in the United States. Hard red winter wheat and hard red spring wheat. Winter wheat is grown as a winter annual, obviously, and red winter wheat is used mainly for making bread, rolls, all-purpose flours. Hard red spring wheat is a summer annual and is mainly used for making bread. It's actually known as bread wheat. And then there's soft red winter wheat, used more for like special pastries, cakes, the finer flour and crackers, and it's a winter annual. And soft white wheat is used for things like also cakes, breakfast food, pastries, and it's grown more in the Washington, Oregon, California area. It's also a winter annual. And hard white wheat is used for like things like bread and pizza, and it's grown in Kansas, Nebraska, that area. It's a winter annual. And then durum wheat is a fairly important one in North Dakota. A lot of the world's durum is grown in North Dakota. It's used mainly it has a lower gluten content, so it's not good for making bread, but it's important for making pasta, spaghetti, macaroni, things like that. And it's a summer annual. And then barley, or Hordeum vulgare, is one of the oldest cultivated crops. It also originated in the Fertile Crescent over 10,000 years ago. And it's tolerant of some adverse conditions like drought, frost, saline soil, things like that. And it matures earlier than other small grains. And right now, North Dakota and Idaho, Montana produce about 70% of the barley in the U.S. And it's used in things like bread and soup occasionally, but the main use for barley is for malt, in the malting industry, for making beer. And there's two main types, like 6-row and 2-row barley, and the picture on the left just shows the difference between those. And this one all just tells a little more about the vegetative characteristics and adaptations. It's similar to other small grains. It's got a crown with multiple tillers. The crown is just kind of the root area right under the ground, and it ends up with multiple tillers, several stalks or branches. And their inflorescence, once again, is a spike with either 2 or 6 rows of spikelets, like the picture on the last slide. And the hull is fused to the seed. That's one reason it's a little more difficult to use, because you have to extract the hull from the seed. And the lemma, or the kind of the little leaf-like, structure that protects the outside the grain, has a long awn. The awn is just the long, thready, spiky thing that comes off. So barley has like what looks like a long beard on it. And for human consumption, the hull must be removed by a process called pearling. So like barley that's for use in soup and whatever is called pearled barley. You have to basically like scrape or polish the hull off, because it doesn't come off easily. And it's also a cool season annual grass, and there's both spring and winter varieties. Uses of barley, mostly for livestock feed, and it doesn't have adequate gluten levels for making raised bread. There's some types of bread that it's used as a partial ingredient, but on its own it wouldn't work for bread flour. The brewery industry uses about 1/3 of the crop. They select the barley for amylase activity and low grain protein, and it's the most important grain for making beer. And part of the reason is because of the hull that stays on the grain, and it produces some of the distinct taste that's desired in beer. And then oats, or Avena sativa, was actually domesticated later than some of the other small grains. It may have originally been a weed in some of the cultivated wheat or barley. It's high in fiber and protein, and it's a good livestock feed, especially for horses. And right now, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin are the leading oats producing states. And here's a description of the oats plant. It's an annual grass that can be about 3 feet tall. The plant has 3 to 8 tillers. The inflorescence is a branched panicle. A panicle is kind of a looser inflorescence than the spike on wheat and barley. It's kind of got little branches that the individual grains hang off of. And the individual spikelets, each individual little spike, or branch, has up to 7 florets, such as the small flower. And 3 or 4 usually produce grain. Some of them don't produce much of anything. And the palea and lemma, which are the hull, stick to the grain, and it's also dehulled for human consumption. And it grows best in the moist, temperate climates, kind of like North Dakota, or Minnesota, areas like that. It's usually planted as a summer annual, but there are winter varieties also. And one of the several uses of oats, a lot of it was planted in, the old days for horses. Well, it still is planted as an animal feed, but the acreage has declined somewhat since horses are no longer used, or hardly ever used, as draft animals for farming anymore. And it's a really good horse feed because the grain is unlikely to cause nutritional and digestive disorders that some other grains are for horses. And it's actually regained some popularity because of reported cholesterol-lowering properties. It doesn't actually really lower cholesterol more than any other high-fiber food. So it's good for you, but it's not like it's a magic bullet for lowering cholesterol that some of the advertisements would make you think. And it's also used as a companion crop for establishing small-seeded crops like alfalfa. I think we've looked at that before. The alfalfa is a really tiny, delicate plant when it first comes up, and the oats, kind of protects it, and then the oats can be harvested, and then the alfalfa, by that time the alfalfa is established, and it, doesn't need protection as much. And oat straw is also used as animal bedding. They harvest the oats, they bale the straw and use it for animal bedding. And then rye, or Sicele cereale, is it's also co-evolved as a weed with wheat or barley. It was domesticated in Europe, maybe 2000 BC. It's got really good tolerance to cold and drought, and it also tolerates low fertility soils. And it's an important bread and livestock feed in the early days in North America. It was one of the important bread and livestock feed crops. It's usually rye bread. What you hear as rye bread is actually mixed with wheat to make bread. It can't be used for raised bread by itself because it doesn't have much gluten, but it gets mixed with wheat and it gives the bread a distinctive taste. And then the description and adaptation, this picture just shows kind of the difference between barley, rye, wheat, and oats in general. It's a tall grass with multiple tillers, and the inflorescence is a spike also, like a lot of the other ones. It can be a winter or summer annual. Winter rye is used as a cover crop in the northern areas to protect soil from wind or water erosion. And it can also be used as a nutrient scavenger to pick up excess fertilizer if there's excess nutrients after corn crop. And in the spring, the winter rye regrows rapidly, and it can be used as forage for animals. And then sorghum is a tropical plant. It's native to Africa, and it was domesticated around maybe 5000 BC. And in the world, it ranks fourth after rice, corn, and wheat as a human food crop. It's not maybe as important for human food in the U.S. as it is some other places, but especially important in drought-prone areas of the tropics. In the U.S., it's mainly used for livestock feed and forage in some areas like in the south where it's too hot or dry for corn. And this is just a description, adaptations of the sorghum plant. It actually looks a lot like corn. It's an annual grass with a thick stalk. It can be 15 feet tall, and it looks a lot like corn, except the head you can see is quite a bit different. And the grain sorghum in the United States has been selected for a short stature. It's only maybe 4 feet tall. And individual plants can have as many as 2,000 grains. It's got more of an extensive root system than corn does, and waxy leaves, small leaf area, and ability to curl leaves. So those are all important adaptations to hot, dry conditions. Plants that can curl their leaves when it gets hot are able to conserve moisture. And it also can become dormant in an extreme drought and then start growing again when conditions improve. And it's adapted, once again, it's a tropical plant, so it's adapted to temperatures about 85, and it's not tolerant of frost or cold at all. And there's 4 types of sorghum. Grain sorghum is what's harvested for grain, or the whole plant for animal feed. And sweet sorghum is used for silage and syrup. In areas of the southern United States, they make make pancake syrup out of sorghum, and it's actually like some friends I have from the south. So that was the main syrup they had on their pancakes when they were growing up. They didn't have maple syrup as much down there. And then Sudan grass is a type that's used for hay. Grow it and bale it up like regular hay. And then broom corn is also, I've never actually seen this, but it's also used to make brooms. And then forage grasses, which are just like used for grazing or hay, different, as a food source for livestock, especially cattle, sheep, other ones like that, ruminants like cattle and sheep. And there's 2 main groups of forage grasses, and cool season and warm season grasses. And you can see from the chart kind of shows, it's like, once again, like the cool season, grass is the top one. Smooth brome grass is a cool season, so you can see there's more available in the spring, and then it kind of as in the hot summer days, it kind of levels out, kind of goes dormant and doesn't grow as well. And then as it cools off, it starts that you get more of it in the fall. Again, it kind of regrows and it comes back. Whereas switchgrass and Bermuda grass are warm season grasses, so they're more available during the hotter times of the summer. And so like the cool season perennial grasses are usually grown alone or else with legumes like alfalfa or red clover, as a hay mixture. And they grow best in cool, moist climates with temperatures about 75. And once again, when it gets really warm or by drought, then the growth is reduced. There's two types of cool season grasses, tall and short. And so tall growing cool season grasses are just, they get to be a height about 3 to 4 feet, basically. And this is Timothy grass in the picture on the left, but there's like different types, smooth brome grass, reed canary grass, a few others that get fairly tall. And their yield is affected by nitrogen fertility, and all of them flower in the spring, and if they're harvested, they will regrow, but the regrowth won't flower. And then short-growing cool season grasses, there's others, but the major one is Kentucky bluegrass, Pulla pratensis. And there's a diagram of the plant. And then this is also the common lawn grass and turf grass. It's the one that most people use on their lawns. It's also for, just regular turf or like golf courses and stuff, at least in the northern areas of the country. And it's got a shallow root system, and it's susceptible to, if you pull up grass from your lawn, it's not a very deep root. And it's also susceptible to heat and drought. And that's one reason why, like in the hot, dry days of the summer, even if you water your grass a lot, if it's mostly a Kentucky bluegrass lawn, it doesn't look very good just because it's a cool season grass. It doesn't do as well when it's hot. But then it tends to come back again when it cools off in the early, late summer, early fall. And then warm season perennial grasses are ones that grow best around 90 degrees, and they don't grow much below 50. And they have a pronounced winter dormancy in temperate regions. They, aren't active in the winter at all. And there's two categories, native and introduced. And so the native warm season grasses are tolerant to drought better than cool season grasses, and they can survive extreme cold. They're developed in this area, so they do grow best in in the hotter days of summer. They've developed a tolerance for the winter cold. And the one on the left on the top is big blue stem, and that's one of the most striking native tallgrass prairie plants. It's a plant about 4 to 6 feet tall. It has a distinctive three branched head, and the stem is a dark purplish color. And this is one plant that's called, they call it the ice cream plant for cattle because they really like it. And if it's growing in the area, they'll eat it before anything else. There's some others, little blue stem, which it's not closely related, but it looks a lot like the bigger blue stem. And then buffalo grasses are shorter native grasses from more arid regions. And buffalo grass is on the picture on the bottom. It's a shorter, kind of wiry looking grass that grows better in, if you have like some buffalo grass in your lawn, it grows better in the hotter days of summer. Okay, that's all we have for this for this chapter, so please let me know if you have any questions.